I'm going to open it up for questions and comments. Could you please identify yourself? We do need you to speak into a microphone if you have one so that people online can hear. And I'll also wait for any questions or comments that might come via our virtual audience. I'll start this end of the room. If you do have a comment, please keep it pithy and short. I might cut you off if it's not. If you have a question, keep it to one, please.
Thank you very much. I think my name is Pierre Landell Mills from the Partnership for Transparency Fund, Exwell, etc. Sorry?
That doesn't amplify. I'm afraid you speak up, but that's linked, I'm afraid, to our online.
Perhaps if I stand up.
Yes.
I'm Pierre Landell Mills. I come from Partnership for Transparency Fund, Exwell Bank. I've been involved in this particular process for about 40 years, maybe more. I think that we're grappling with a high level of complexity here. And actually, because everybody who made these wonderful presentations spoke so fast, it was actually quite difficult to disentangle some of the threads. But I want to pick up on what David said. And something I think is a thread all the way through is that we have to have a theory of change. And implicitly, actually, we all have theories of change which we are applying here. But what I think is new in this debate compared to the last 40 years is the recognition of the importance of politics, as David said. And I think that what we are missing, perhaps, is putting this discussion in the context, perhaps, of the most interesting work that's been done on this, of Douglas North, on limited access states, and understanding that, in fact, we're dealing with an intra-elite struggle, and first of all, is there any role for outsiders? And if there is a role for outsiders, how does that relate between civil society and this intra-elite struggle for power? I mean, we're kind of recognizing, I'm going to be quite brief, but I think we recognize that actually most of the countries we're talking about, the people who are in charge of the countries are not interested in the things that outsiders who are in the development business are most interested in. They're interested in, first of all, maintaining power, and secondly, extracting the maximum benefit for the elite, and usually themselves particularly. Okay, so I think unless we understand that then the role of civil society in that is how can it affect that struggle, and then a much more difficult question is how can the people outside work with that civil society that is interested in affecting change? And unless we sort of put it in this sort of much broader context, I think we're lost, frankly.
Great, thank you very much, Pierre. I'm going to, sorry Malcolm, I'm going to swing right over to Sue Unsworth, who's on that side, because I'm pretty sure she's going to follow up on something that Pierre said, maybe. In the front row.
Thanks a lot. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Of course, I agree on the importance of thinking about political context. But I also think we shouldn't lose sight of quite a bit of interesting research that's been done on the importance of institutional design in helping to mobilize different groups. And I'm thinking about that research that Judith Tendler did in Northeast Brazil on the health program. I'm thinking about the way in which you design and implement a tax regime and the impact that has on different of the willingness of different groups of citizens to organize. I'm thinking about the Maharashtra Employment Guarantee Scheme and the legal guarantee that facilitated mobilization. I'm thinking of the FLEGT VPA. This is the EU forest law enforcement program, part of which was a very cleverly designed multi-stakeholder process that gave civil society groups an equal status. The way in which you design interventions matters a lot for the kind of demand-side response. And then just a second plea, and that is that when we're talking about non-state actors, not just to think in terms of civil society organizations, but to think about private sector actors. And similarly, the way in which the design of state policies facilitates mobilization of private sector actors.
Thank you. Could you pass it behind you, Sue? Gentleman there. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jake Allen. I'm the GTF Programme Manager at Christian Aid.
Okay, speak up a bit because it doesn't amplify you too well.
Okay. A bit of a reflection, which I'd also welcome some re-reflection on from the panel, which I think touches on many, if not all, of the issues which were raised in the presentations. And largely this comes down to the idea of context, which is a word that gets used in all, many development things, right from the Paris Declaration right down to, each of our sort of individual project applications. Talk about how important it is, and of course, with governance, as Fletcher pointed out, being about people and being about systems, these are very, very specific to local contexts, and therefore the changes that happen and the changes that people expect, the interactions that they have with governance are going to be very specific and very local. Yet our expectations and our narrative of change tends to be national, if not regional, if not international, and that stems both from obviously the desire that kind of we all have to find that answer, but perhaps avoiding the answer to that question, which is there isn't an answer. But also the way that funding is dispersed, which was mentioned as well, which is that it tends to come in very large packages. So I wonder if the panel would reflect also on the appetite within their institutions to sort of see success as success only if it happens in a local area, and almost to take a sort of fund manager approach to their projects rather than this constant pull upwards.
Okay, thank you very much. She's coming into the middle now, right at the front. I will come back at some point, but trying to do it on the basis of order. Right at the front here and then behind.
Thank you. I'm Fiona Napier with Global Witness. We also run a GTF programme on making the forest transparent. And I had a comment and a question, really. It's a point on natural resources governance, which Fletcher brought up using briefly a salt example in Ghana. I think there's possibly a lot more experience that we should mine, possibly through the GTF programme, around natural resource governance and the impact that has on, for want of a better word, we're using at the moment, social accountability. I think there are some very different levers that operate there. And in relation to what David was saying around peasant democracies, certainly in our experience, there's much greater engagement in rural populations with natural resource management. And I think some of it's quite dynamic and potentially more politically potent than we're realising. You've only got to look at land, which will be the issue in the 21st century, and look how that mobilises rural poor, largely, and will continue to mobilise in the future.
What's your measure of political potency?
I don't have one. But it leads slightly to my second question, which is I would be very interested to know whether the GTF programme does have this reach, and I suspect not, but to look at what are the demand and supply questions, levers around succession crises. What causes amongst supply and demand, if you're using that analysis, how does that lead to current spate of unrest at national level that we've witnessed, not just Arab Spring, but also elsewhere? Thank you.
Just behind you. Thanks.
Thank you. Stephen Cummins, University of California, Los Angeles, a co-author of the WDR 2004. So, Kathy, thank you for improving on the triangle. From recent work in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and in Gujarat, I come back to the issue of fragile states and uncivil society and the challenge of mobilization where having just been through a big demonstration in favor of the government of Sri Lanka and against UN human rights reporters, you can do a lot of mobilization that can be very conflictive. So how does this process of social accountability deal in situations where citizen voice is not only fractured, but often against each other's throats?
Okay, I'm going to stop just there because I'm going to give our panellists a chance for kind of one-liner responses to a few of those, and then I'll try and come out to you again, because otherwise it's not much of a conversation. Fletcher, don't try and attempt a comprehensive set of answers. Yeah. Just pick one or two things where you can give fairly sharp, short responses to, and then I'll pass over to Kathy.
Yeah, okay. First of all, on the resources bit, I think, in the presentation I had presented as raising the stakes. In a way, because we're looking at a group of, community-based tracking, all kind of things of social accountability. But the big question to me has always been, what is really is in the interest of citizens here? Are we kind of mechanically trying to drive a formula to drive them to ask for change? But when it comes to natural resources, it seems to come much easier because they have a lot more at stake. I mean, this example I gave about salt, they've been mining that salt for more than 500 years, and suddenly they find a company coming through. They find a government coming through, and nothing is being explained until a media organization and an organization that we supported then created a platform to discuss, and they were energetic about it. And similarly, around a number of programs I would have given as examples. So to me, it kind of seems to be a hook, like one would say about taxation. The other bit would be around natural resource management. So that's what I would say. The last issue is just an appreciation that, in fact, most of the countries, Steve, on fragility, some of the countries now are going a lot. Malawi is a country where I come from, and I know that is a big question now for the Tiritosi Fund, the governance fund that has just been set, because the visibility of NGOs at the top comes quite quickly, but it leads them into trouble. It's connected in very different ways, and how one deals with that is quite a question.
Thank you. Kathy, do you want to pick up anything? I wonder if you particularly, but feel free, Sue's point about the importance of institutional design.
Yep. Okay. So yeah, I won't try and comment on all of it because I find myself agreeing with most of what everybody's saying. But so just a few points. Nice to meet you finally, Pierre. Pierre is a very big name still in the World Bank, so I didn't realise I'd get to finally meet you. Nice to meet you. I completely agree with what you say, and I want to link it to the development effectiveness agenda. I think you're absolutely right. I was in Tanzania last week, and what's clearly going on is, in many of our countries, is a struggle between the elites, and the role of outsiders is questionable and questioned by many of our government counterparts. And in Tanzania, I was country manager in Ghana, but in Tanzania, they're even a step ahead of the Ghanaians in using, I think, the whole aid effectiveness agenda as a bit of a smokescreen, to be honest, and very much as a kind of layer between us and them, and very clearly saying, this development effectiveness stuff is fine, but here's your PRSP, but actually 3 weeks later we're going to publish our own national development plan without any of the consultation or disclosure behind it, and that's what we're using. Which is what happens and has happened in Tanzania, and somehow, none of the donors realised that this might happen and that they weren't really into it. So I think you're absolutely right, but then the question for us is how, within those contexts where those questions about outsider roles are being legitimately asked, in my view, does one still play a useful role? And I think the way that we work in terms of how we use our leverage in getting local actors together is very important. I think the bank has a huge role to be much more proactive on the information side and fixing the information asymmetries, which we're only just beginning to exploit. And I think how we kind of create the spaces for debate and contestation and consensus building, hopefully, including in fragile states, which is particularly important to do, as the latest WDR says, is a very different role for development partners, which isn't necessarily helped by this development effectiveness agenda, I feel. So that's my comeback on that one, Pierre. In terms of your question, couldn't agree more, Sue. I think it's very much about politics, but politics and institutional design within that context, and I think that the Tendler study in Northeast Brazil shows that. And I also agree that it's clearly not just about civil society, and as Steve has pointed out, there are civil and uncivil elements of civil society. I think one actor that gets left out a lot still in the literature here, and I'll say this with a caveat, is Parliament. And so in the work that we're doing in Tanzania at the moment to try and figure out how in this very entrenched one-party system we can begin to address some of the governance constraints to improve water delivery and I was looking at the Tendler article because of this, in Tanzania. Clearly there's a lot more to be done with MPs, but how to do it is the question, because we, and I'm sure others, have been very guilty about throwing lots of money at parliamentary capacity building over the years, and I think most of it, to be honest, has been rubbish. So one of the things that's coming out in Tanzania now is the importance of working with MPs out of their committees and in a very informal setting, because the pull of the parties is so strong, both in Ghana and Tanzania, once you get them in committee, that it's, I think the advice from kind of participatory research in Tanzania is you've got to get them as individuals and on that representative faction outside the parties, because their representation faculty is so weak compared to the political pool of their very strong parties, that that's the place to do it. So agree with you too. On the GTF, Roy and others who asked about the GTF, I mean, this is only now becoming an issue for us because we unfortunately, or fortunately, didn't have the kind of flexibility that DFID had until very recently. And we now have this Global Fund for Social Accountability, which is going to the board, and I'm happy not to be there while it goes to the board, because I think the real work that's going to happen is as we start to give out money and how we use the application process to do this intelligently. And I know DFID has really struggled with this, and as Fletcher says, you could hire anybody in any country to write you a good grant proposal. I mean, if you or I were to retire, we could go back to and write grant proposals for people, but how do you use that process to really embed these processes in a theory of change that becomes more about an ongoing funding of a process, I think, which David also mentioned, is something we're going to really struggle with after the board approval of this.
Okay, that's great. I might be able to give everyone a chance to come back in, but I've just got a couple of things on my new toy here from our virtual audience before I go out. Yes, I have to justify its use, and so thank you for those of you sending comments. But there's one, David, Soren Janvik, a student in Denmark, says he's a big fan, but there's a but. Would he or the panel elaborate on the prospects for politically viable alternatives to current policies? I'm not quite sure there's a simple answer to that, but I'm going to get you to think about that. And also, Hilary Williams, Quality Advisor at World Vision, is a big fan of you, Fletcher, and so I thought you'd like to know that, and very much appreciates the passion that you've brought to this work and see it as very important. I'm going to go out now for a few questions here in the room. I've got two in the centre here, the lady here next to Steve, and then over the gentleman there, and then there are some over on that side. Could you keep them short so we can try and get everybody in?
Okay, and you probably can just give me a quick reflection at the end. I come from the Freshwater Action Network. We've come back from the World Water Forum last week in Marseille. Water is a very strategic issue these days. It's got a lot of profile. And GTF partners, there's 31 of them in 16 countries, calling for local accountability, transparency, participation, and really at a very local, getting some great results. And in that framework last year, the right to water was recognised, and we think this is critical. But then you have a global framework coming up in Rio, looking at sustainable development. You've got the major groups on women and youth calling for the right to water to be central. And this week in New York, the negotiations are trying to get the right to water out of Rio. So that's sustainable development about livelihoods and health and education, all those. Of course, I've been in water a long time, so I see water as central to all of that. So just to reflect, we do that global and local, that call for all that. That's it.
Gentleman standing up there.
Foley Ahaya from Strategic Agenda and Transparent Aid. Quick point and also a quick question. The point is transparency is all very good and accountability is great, but you have to have the ability to enable and to empower people to act on the information they get access to. That's one key issue. We work with CSOs in Nigeria on small projects to help them improve their capability. So we're working on a project at the moment in northern Nigeria, which is a peace and conflict mediation and resolution program. And the key thing with that is that the donor we work with pays that CSO to train women to go to villages and become intelligence gatherers to try and mediate in conflicts and stop them blowing up. Now, the issue with that is that the CSO is very, very capable of what it does, but it finds it hard to report and provide evidence as to the impact it's having. So what we're doing is we're putting together a mobile data capture system so they can input data on their mobile phones to quantify the impact they're having, and in turn provide justification to the donor for increased funds or maintenance of funds. So my question is really, what are the World Bank and DFID doing to incorporate greater grassroots monitoring evaluation capability in their projects? We believe that the grassroots has a very good indication of what is happening on the ground with projects. But at the moment, it's all about the 3 Ws in monitoring evaluation. It's the wrong people asking the wrong questions at the wrong time.
Okay, that's all right. 3 Ws, haven't heard that before. Right, over this side, please. Next to Lenny, and then Lenny, and I think there was one other person behind, with the gentleman with the glasses.
Thank you. Ed Barnett, London School of Economics. 2 quick questions. Where does this social accountability fit within the WDR 2004 framework that talked of long and short route accountability as being different things, and there ought to be a greater focus on the short route? Is that the social accountability, or is it across both? And if it is, how are they different? And to what extent, the relationship between social accountability and advocacy?
Great.
Thank you. Lenny Wild from ODI. I had a quick comment, which is I think it's great that we all seem to be talking a lot about the importance of paying attention to politics and to context, but I fear that we're still not very specific about the actual features within the context, within the political drivers, which shape whether or not these initiatives will work. I did some work in Malawi at the end of last year looking at a community scorecards approach for public services, and there's some very specific features to the context which meant they were able to achieve some concrete improvements. Features about the presence of local leaders, including chiefs, but also district officials who are open to reform, good local brokers who could really work politically to bring actors together, and actually certain features about the communities themselves, that they had a capacity to take on and start to deliver aspects of services, really, and to contribute to services in different ways themselves. It wasn't just them demanding of others. Now, some of those are very context-specific, they're sector-specific, but I think there are also opportunities here for Fletcher and others to look across countries and to actually give us a much better evidence base of the specific political and governance features, the constraints and the opportunities that we can work more creatively across supply and demand sides to address, which I think takes us back also to David's comments about let's start with the problem and not think that we can use one to fix the other.
Right, thank you. And right behind you, gentleman with the glass.
Phil Barnard-Carter from GHK Consulting. We've been talking about demand for good governance and the supply of good governance, and it sounds to me that there are great similarities with rights-based approaches, where we're talking about rights holders having better knowledge of their rights and being able to use them, and duty bearers having greater capacity to deliver on these. And I'd be interested to hear the panel's views on what the similarities and differences are with that.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, I'm now going to, and there's one over here, sorry, right the other side, by the door, and then I'm going to take it back to the panel. I haven't got any more on my toy here.
Hello, my name's Amrita, and I'm from UCL. I was just making a point following this gentleman's point. During my MSc, I learned about different accounts of accountability, and I was wondering how you actually ensured that grassroots levels, people at the grassroots level, can hold governments and local companies to account, because a lot of the projects seem to fall down because local people couldn't read the accounts. They didn't have the literacy skills. So how are they going to hold people to account? And the projects that did work used a form of oral communication. So some educated person would read out the accounts, and people could then dispute them to what had actually happened. But what happens when you don't have that educated person?
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks very much for your contributions. I'm actually going to ask Roy, do you have a couple of reflections on this?
I have 4 reflections. The first is
I'm sure I said
that
2.
the majority of work that happens in a lot of the countries is non-aid funded. If you look at what the majority of civil society, operating in most countries, rarely gets any aid. And I think we need to understand that and be aware that actually, if you're thinking about bringing about change, we need to think about how you work with some of those groups without always thinking about money and aid, relationships, etc. I don't fully agree with what Pierre said, because my own experience is that elites or leaders in developing countries are not that different from leaders elsewhere. Often it's very similar motivations, etc. So I don't believe that leaders in developing countries are all just about wanting to stay in power. Some do, some don't, and we need to differentiate that. My second point is about the CAR framework, because a lot of the Governance and Transparency Fund started with the idea of, to bring about development, you need capable, accountable, responsive governments. And my own reflection on that is, to get capable, accountable, responsive governments, you actually need CAR citizens. You need citizens that are capable, also willing to be accountable to each other, up and down, and also responsive to changes in their society. My third point picks up on two aspects of two other questions that were raised about what does all this enable. Part of the GTF, what it's enabled us to do is to work at different levels, at local level, national, local, and international level. And part of the beauty of it is finding good ways in which, if you're working at particular levels, you can add value to others who are working at other levels. The final point was about, and that also links up with Jake's point about would we be happy about supporting work which is leading to transformational change at a local level. I think if the evidence is there that it really is leading to long-term transformational change, we probably would. Final point is about beneficiary feedback pilots. We in DFID are really looking at how can we make sure that we don't just focus on the 3 Ws, but we try and incorporate what is it that beneficiaries, all of the people who are supposed to benefit from all of this, are getting from this. And we're trying to think more creatively about how we can actually build that into our own programming. Sorry, Alison.
That's right. I'm sure that was 5, Roy, but I stopped counting. Over to you, David. I mean, you answer whatever you like, but it seemed to me there was an interesting point that Sue was making about, yes, the politics matter, but it's also a case of institutional design. Do you have a view on that?
Let me say what Pierre would probably say in response first, which is that the suggestion is not that politicians in developing countries are nastier people or have different motives than politicians in advanced countries. It's a question of what is the cost-effective way for them to keep in power in the two cases, and that's very different. That's the Pierre argument, I think, as I understand. Yeah, I mean, Sue wants us to think about sort of clever design things which make a difference, and I think that's right. It's very difficult to provide the answers, but responding also to Søren in Denmark, this needs to be partly about finding clever ways of interacting with national politics, with the elites in power who are the ultimate deciders for the reasons Pierre gives. And I can't give any answers now, but I hope that Søren will come to the meeting in Copenhagen on the 30th, where a group of research programs are trying to present what they've found on this and suggest some clever ways of working in very difficult environments.
Okay.
But just final comment on natural resources. Yeah, I mean, where there's a natural resource involved, it is more dynamic. People will be motivated, but of course the dangers of doing harm by creating conflict are that much greater, and therefore the need to be very context specific is even greater, and the dangers of having a single sort of global model which you apply to the situation, as raised by Christian Aid, are that much more
It's an
problematic.
interesting question, though, isn't it? Whether you kind of get more traction where people feel they've got skin in the game, as it were. And I think that's, Kathy, there was a point about the similarities or otherwise to the rights-based approach. Do you want to just touch on that? What do you think
And
about
to the
that?
WDR. So the short answer is yes, it is the short route. Advocacy, I see there being a number of social accountability tools, and in most of them, I think advocacy can be, so a lot of those tools are about collecting good information, and the advocacy then is about how you use that information to affect change, right? So I see it as a strategy within any of those sets of tools that we put up. I see a lot of similarities with the rights-based approach too, especially when you take the rights-based approach to the rights and responsibilities that citizens have, which is something we're struggling with in Tanzania at the moment. So very similar. Just a couple of other points, if I may. Information is also about, somebody in here said about teaching, about giving information, but also being able to hold governments accountable. I mean, this is one of the reasons that we're really bad at doing this stuff and learning from it. We had a very interesting experience where we did this effectively, I would say, on oil and gas in Ghana, which maybe brings it back to extractive, and that's a bit easier. We failed terribly using the same strategies, the same theories of change on budget information. So in Ghana now we actually have a very interesting institutional design that I hope somebody will start to look at, called the PAC, which is a Public Interest and Accountability Committee, which is trying to come up with a nifty design which brings together a lot of these issues and which seems to be, I think, quite hopeful in fixing a lot of the accountability bottlenecks that there will likely be around oil and gas in Ghana. In terms of the 3 Ws, I love the 3 Ws, I hadn't heard that a lot either before. We have done a lot of experimenting now with using ICT as a mechanism to get feedback from either direct beneficiaries, or more often than not, it's better to have an intermediary. So Daraja, which is a big NGO as well in Tanzania at the moment, is using mobile phones to get feedback on water point mapping systems to see where they're broken down. Having a big constraint, which they didn't expect, in that people won't input the information. They originally thought maybe the question was too hard on the mobile, but it wasn't. There just seems to be a reluctance to people participating and providing that kind of information, even though it's anonymous in the Tanzanian context. So it's not as easy as just giving people a mobile phone and expecting them to become monitors of their own.
I'm going to, if you don't mind, Kathy, I'll stop you there. I know there's lots more to say, but I want to give the last word to Fletcher. Just maybe a reflection on Lenny's point, which was looking for sort of more unpacking of this notion of context.
Just to agree with Lenny that indeed we have kind of a lot of at our hands at GTFs now, and we had to start somewhere. And when you begin to look at an issue like the one you quoted in Malawi in community-based performance monitoring around inputs, provisions, it gives you a lot. Initially, you leave projects to go and let organizations do what they think they are doing, and then as you're following and begin to ask the questions, they actually come up with even better questions of exploration. So we partner with them and then begin to discover what those features are. It would be interesting if maybe through KPMG we were to do this linking, I think the point you suggested, around and across the GTFs, and say we've got all these projects. Can we do some analysis of what are some of the features that seem to surround change? And then the other additional dimension though to it, how to support that change. Because that's, again, there's a lot of capacity development programming sometimes that is just around workshops. When in fact what you don't need is a workshop, you need another mechanism to be able to support organizations and citizens to engage. So that is again another debate around how do you support change to happen.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to give the last word in terms of questions to Jonathan Glennie, who's a research fellow of ours now based in Colombia, who says, why do we always say that developing country leaders have mixed motives at best, whereas the motives of donors are always considered impeccable? All actors have complex motives. Indeed. And on that note, I want to thank very much indeed to our panel, who I think have given us a terrific amount to think about, to Kathy, stopping over on your way back to Washington, to Roy, coming back down from East Kilbride, to David, of course, and most of all to Fletcher, who has really devoted the last 3 years of his life to this programme. He's got another year to go. Including moving his life to Malawi at one point. So thank you to you, and thank you all very much indeed.